Lecture 24, Toward the Early Modern.
Welcome back to the final lecture in this course on turning points in medieval history. We began our exploration of the moments and people who changed the course of history with an analysis of the fall of Rome. Fittingly, the events discussed in this first lecture are the most significant for this course as a whole because it is from the ashes and memory of Rome that the entire medieval world develops. You could call this the swerve that sets us on course to the Renaissance or early modern period. In today's lecture, we're going to discuss a swerve of a different kind. This is the National Book Award Prize winner by Stephen Greenblatt, which appeared in 2011. This text is also called The Swerve and has as its subtitle the phrase, quote, "How the World Became Modern," end quote. In a nutshell, Greenblatt's argument is that a single event in the 15th century, the discovery of a lost Roman manuscript entitled On the Nature of Things, caused a dramatic ripple effect through society that made the European world cease to be what we think of as medieval and instead start to become what we think of as modern. As you might guess, I think that Greenblatt is wrong about this characterization. And to be fair, he does acknowledge in several places the debt to the medieval world and the other turning points we've discussed so far that made the change about which he is writing possible. At the same time, however, he overstates the significance of the main event under discussion in his book. A single event in the early 15th century cannot be the sole reason for the rise of what we have come to call the Renaissance or the early modern. If we've learned anything over the course of the last 23 lectures, it's that the events of history are interconnected and that one turning point often gives rise or leads to another. But I think that in some ways, Greenblatt gets the general idea really right, exactly by getting his specific point really wrong. In other words, the event that he describes is absolutely a turning point that shifts society in a new direction, but it is not a swerve the likes of which the world had never seen before. The world of medieval Europe came into existence with the fall of Rome and swerved when the Muslims conquered the Iberian Peninsula, and again when Charlemagne founded his palace school, and again when the Fourth Lateran Council issued its canons, and yet again when the Black Death raced through the countryside. What Greenblatt has done is identify just one in a series of turning points that have been leading us inevitably to the rise of a new kind of social order, one that this lecture series has shown had been germinating for hundreds of years. But let's go back for a moment to the story Greenblatt tells, because it is a really great story. And even if Greenblatt hadn't written a book that won such an important prize and so much acclaim, it still might have been a perfectly fitting story on which to end this course. First of all, Greenblatt is a great writer and storyteller, and he brings the events of the year 1417 to life as very few scholars could do. His account is so thorough, so detailed, you can almost smell the medieval world through which a man named Poggio Bracciolini traveled as he sought and made his incredible discovery. The account of what happened is also vastly entertaining and grounded in a really solid understanding of what the European world was like in the 15th century, and I highly recommend that you check out The Swerve if you have the chance. Here, in much abbreviated form, is the story. In the early 15th century, a skilled scribe named Poggio Bracciolini, who came from a well-established but provincial Italian family, had the good fortune to serve a series of popes in an official capacity. He transcribed official documents for the office of the papacy, and when he was at leisure, he indulged in a hobby that was somewhat unusual but not too terribly uncommon. He tracked down ancient books, and when he made a particularly interesting find, he either had the book transcribed or contrived to find some way to persuade the owner of the book, and this was usually a monastery, to part with it. In this, he was aided by generous patrons who were also interested in learning about the past, in recovering lost knowledge. Many of them subsidized his hunt for books, as surviving correspondence attests. But Bracciolini was too busy with what we might call his day job to really pursue this interest as fully as he would like, until the day when his employer and master, Pope John XXIII, was declared by the Council of Constance to be unfit to serve as pope. Now, at the time the council convened, in 1414, there were in fact 3 claimants to the position of pope, as this was the time of the Western Schism, when rival popes were competing against one another in Rome, Avignon, and elsewhere. This event itself could be the subject for another lecture or 7, but what's important for our purposes today is that in the early 15th century, Bracciolini found himself without a job and without clear future prospects. His former employer was sitting in a German prison, waiting for the powerful Medici family to ransom him. John XXIII of the 15th century is not considered a pope by the Catholic Church today and is only referred to in its official histories as an anti-pope, with the Catholic Encyclopedia calling attention to the fact that John, whose real name was Baldassare Cosa, had been a man much more concerned with secular, worldly matters than religious or spiritual ones. But that is neither here nor there. The Pope was out of a job, and the members of his household, including Bracciolini, were told to fend for themselves. So many people would have taken this as a serious blow, but Bracciolini saw an opportunity. Freed from the obligations of his day job, he was now free to go book hunting into the hard-to-reach areas of the medieval world. Those with interests similar to his had long been interested in trying to gain access to monasteries high in the mountains or far to the north of Italy, as it was thought there might be some ancient books there that had rested untouched and of little interest to anyone for centuries. Because, as you'll remember from any number of our earlier lectures, monastic institutions in the medieval world were for centuries the centers of learning and knowledge. So that is how Bracciolini found his way to the Abbey of Fulda in southern Germany, which had been in existence since the 8th century. This would be a logical place for an ancient manuscript to be found, as the 9th century abbot of this institution, Rabanus Maurus, had had a desire to collect and preserve the knowledge of the ancient world that was on par with Charlemagne's, and he had gathered and transcribed numerous texts from the pre-medieval Roman world. As Greenblatt tells it, when Bracciolini first laid hands on the book in the monastery, he might, at first glance, have thought that it was a later and very well-known Latin work, compiled by that same Rabanus Maurus who had made Fulda a center of learning. The works had very similar titles. The poet Lucretius, who had lived in the 1st century BC, had called a compendious treatise he had written De Rerum Natura, while the 9th century monk Rabanus Maurus had named his De Rerum Naturis. But after a moment of examining the manuscript, it must have become clear to Bracciolini that he had found something new. A text written in beautiful, complex Latin lines by a writer and scholar whose name had long been known to the medieval world, but whose work had been deemed forever lost. Scholars such as Bracciolini would have certainly known the work of the Roman poet Ovid, who wrote the words, quote, "The verses of sublime Lucretius are destined to perish only when a single day shall consign the world to destruction," end quote. This line alone would have sent any man interested in books and knowledge off to see if he could find any traces of this marvelous work still in existence. No one had, that is, until Bracciolini did. So what was in this book that was so important and probably made Bracciolini's heart skip a beat or 3 when he realized what he had discovered? Well, what we need to remember first is that Lucretius and his De Rerum Natura, or On the Nature of Things, was a product of the pre-Christian Roman world, and thus it would be expected to explore ideas that a late medieval Christian, even a scholar interested in the past for primarily academic reasons, would find, generally speaking, blasphemous or dangerous. Of course, since Christ had not yet been born when the Roman poet Lucretius was composing his opus, there was a little latitude with which to excuse his thinking. But Lucretius's poem was radical even for its own day, the 1st century BC. In fact, it is possible that the celebrated Roman writer Virgil, who composed the epic poem the Aeneid, hailed for centuries as the best the ancient literary world had to offer, it's possible that Virgil was writing against many of Lucretius's ideas. In the Aeneid, Virgil gives us a hero who is dutiful and pious in all things, who respects tradition, the will of the gods, and accepts his fate even when it compels him to do things he would rather not. In the Aeneid, we get a detailed look at the afterworld, a reassurance that our souls live on after our bodies, and the petulant, grand, intemperate, interfering, generous, and vengeful gods who meddle in the lives of humans on earth. What Lucretius says about all this is, essentially, nonsense. In stunningly beautiful lines of Latin hexameter verse, this writer puts forth a theory of the universe, matter, life, and everything else that is both brilliant and radical, beautiful and troubling. He takes as one of his primary positions that there is no God or gods, and thus no afterlife, no souls. He is, in both the contexts of the ancient world and the medieval one, an atheist. In Lucretius's theory of life, the universe and everything else, all matter, is made up of invisible particles, and this matter is always in the process of becoming something else. In other words, when a flower dies, it is not gone. Its particles break down, return to the earth, reassemble themselves, and become something different. Perhaps another flower, perhaps dirt or grass or worms. Thus, when human beings die, they die. And because humans possess no souls and there is no afterlife, this doesn't really matter. Their bodies will break down, they will be mourned and missed by those who loved them, but they won't know because there is no place for them to be and no knowing or understanding for them to have. There is no God or gods, Lucretius says, but if it makes you feel better to visit a temple or shrine, go ahead. This is okay if it gives you pleasure, because really, if there is no God or afterlife, then what is the point of life but to do what pleases you most? Go to the shrine if it makes you happy. Eat a large meal if that's what you prefer to do, or a small one, or none if that's what you enjoy. Entertain yourself with whatever amusements you prefer. It sounds pretty close to hedonism, but Lucretius was also clear that while pleasure was one of the goals, so was trying to avoid pain. And one way to do this was for humans to work together, something they obviously had done over time to evolve to the point where they presently existed. Lucretius went against much of the thinking of the Roman period by arguing that humans had not once lived in some sort of golden age when life was easy and there was no war and the earth offered up its fruits in abundance with little or no toil. Rather, he held that human civilization, as he and his fellow Romans had come to know it, had evolved out of a period of barbarism and brutality. This thinking obviously would have been troublesome to many people living in the 15th century, as the long-established Judeo-Christian tradition told of a pre-lapsarian paradise, the Garden of Eden, where Adam and Eve had lived until they were expelled by God for sinning and eating from the tree of knowledge, the only tree forbidden to them. What's more, Lucretius had further argued in his poem, humans were fooling themselves if they thought that they were the most important creatures in existence. Emphatically, Lucretius asserted that humans were just one element in a great interlinked chain of existence, an idea that in later centuries would come to be called the Great Chain of Being. Humans were different from antelope and bugs and horses and daisies and sea slugs, but they were not superior. And the idea that Greenblatt has adapted from Lucretius as the title for his book is that of the swerve, or in Latin, clinamen. As Greenblatt succinctly sums it up, quote, "If all the individual particles in their infinite numbers fell through the void in straight lines, pulled down by their own weight like raindrops, nothing would ever exist. But the particles do not move lockstep in a preordained single direction. Occasionally, they swerve. The swerve is only the most minimal of motions, but it is enough to set off a ceaseless chain of collisions." End quote. It is these collisions that make history, and it was the swerve of Bracciolini's pulling De Rerum Natura off the shelf at the library in the monastery of Fulda that created the swerve that, according to Greenblatt, produced the modern world. Now, I absolutely agree that this moment constituted a turning point of extreme importance, but I completely disagree with the idea that it is this moment alone that gave rise to what we might call the modern era. To be fair, I think that if pressed, Greenblatt would certainly acknowledge that this is true. For example, he goes on to tell the story of what happened after Bracciolini rediscovered Lucretius's poem, and what happens is the copy that Bracciolini has made gets recopied and circulated throughout Europe in manuscript form. But what really increases the text's visibility is the fact that the printing press has come into use, so thousands of copies of De Rerum Natura can be printed in the blink of an eye. This fact becomes even more compelling when we learn that it took Bracciolini more than a decade to get the copy of the text he wanted back from the scribe he had hired. Compelled, one thinks, by the need to try and make a living more than anything else, Bracciolini had to leave the manuscript behind at Fulda. But he had engaged a scribe to make a complete copy of the text and then send it on to him in Florence. This arrived after some months and was apparently a very rough, hastily executed copy. Bracciolini then turned this over to Niccolò Niccoli, the most renowned scribe of his day, to make a more elegant version of the text. For years, Bracciolini tried to get the finished product returned to him, and letters to Niccoli from Bracciolini show increasing exasperation and anger. Still, it does not usually take a practiced scribe 12 years to copy a text. So part of what was going on here may have been Niccoli's interest in the subject matter and a desire to hang on to this poem for a bit longer. But this moment in the history of De Rerum Natura does point up the relative merits of print over handwriting when it came to Johannes Gutenberg's innovation, which we just discussed at some length in the lecture right before this one. What happened next is that Lucretius's text then spread throughout the medieval and early modern worlds. It ended up in the hands of Machiavelli, who wrote The Prince and gave posterity the adjective Machiavellian, a word with negative connotations that is shorthand for, quote-unquote, the ends justify the means. Thomas More, author of Utopia, also seems to have been influenced by some of the ideas in Lucretius's text, as do any number of other early modern thinkers and writers. Although many of the ideas in On the Nature of Things might seem to run contrary to other ideas found in early modern humanism, the humanism part, for example, they were still deeply influential and able to be co-opted by those thinkers and intellectuals in the Renaissance who wanted the achievements of individual men to be valued and sought to reconcile religious faith with education and scientific learning, even though Lucretius himself might have felt strongly opposed to such ideas. And as the literati of the early modern period sought to look to the ancient past for guidance, particularly to the Greek and Roman worlds, they also very often tended to imagine, or want to imagine, that humanity had once lived in a time and a place that was very pastoral. In this view, in the past, humans had lived a life of ease and whiled away their days in an eternal warm spring, tending flocks of sheep, composing poetry while resting under a tree, and playing tunes on simple reed pipes. Again, not something Lucretius would have countenanced. But for all the ways that the claim about de rerum natura in the modern world overstates the text's impact or simplifies the idea of a shift from the medieval to early modern period, it also totally gets it right when we think about all the themes we've explored in this course so far, and it serves, as I've said before, as a fitting subject for our final lecture. First of all, and very obviously, the power of the past, our first theme, is everywhere apparent in the story of how this text was discovered and how it came to be more widely disseminated. Bracciolini and plenty of others like him were obsessed with the idea of discovering lost texts from the ancient past. They wanted to know what the great thinkers who had come before them had thought. They were hungry for knowledge that had been mentioned in numerous medieval documents, but which, as a whole, had long been lost. Without the power of the past, this turning point, this swerve, never would have happened. Thus, Bracciolini's story has clear affinities with the story of Charlemagne, with the story of Abelard, the rise of the university system, and the development of ideas about science and medicine. We can invoke here too King Arthur, Alfred the Great's transformation of the kingdom of Wessex into the kingdom of the Anglo-Saxons, the claims to precedence that ignited the controversy of the Great Schism, and more. As we saw in Lecture 1, and in every lecture since then, the past always has had the power to shape the future. The theme of crisis or necessity also comes into play with this turning point. As with the imprisonment of the anti-Pope John XXIII and the dissolution of his household, Bracciolini suddenly found himself without a lord or master, an unenviable position in the medieval world, as we've seen from any number of lectures so far. In some sense, Bracciolini was in a crisis not so much unlike that in which the monks of Lindisfarne found themselves when the Vikings came ashore, or in which the English found themselves when William the Conqueror crossed the Channel and defeated the forces of Harold Godwinson in 1066. Life before the event in question had been one way, and afterward it was very different. Bracciolini had had to adapt to a dramatically changed situation and quickly, and it is in that adaptation that we see another clear example of one of the major themes of our course, the power of the individual personality. Even for the time and place, Bracciolini had to have been quite a character. Someone who had risen from rather humble beginnings to a position of some importance by his own skill and intelligence. Someone with an intellectually curious mind who was able to perform bureaucratic duties by day while indulging in an obsession that in some respects was esoteric and arcane in his free time. Someone who reacted to the end of his professional life as he knew it, not by running for home, but by seizing the opportunity for adventure. He had to have been someone who could charm suspicious monastic librarians into letting him examine their most ancient and precious treasures. Someone who could convince wealthy patrons back in Italy to lend him their financial support so he could pursue his quest. But of course, his singular personality has only become clearly evident to us down through the long marches of time because of larger social changes that were happening and in which he found himself caught up. He was, in some respects, just a piece of flotsam floating in the current of the Western Schism, that event that fragmented the position of the papacy and which was as much a result of nationalist, political, and economic interests as it was religious or spiritual ones. In this respect, he was rather like Tariq ibn Ziyad, who found himself conquering Spain for Islam in spite of himself, or Petrarch, whose larger-than-life intellect and burgeoning humanistic impulse was offered a rare outlet due to a confluence of events in the early 14th century. These events themselves arguably came into being with the changes wrought by the Little Optimum, or medieval warm period, and advances in agriculture. So many of these changes, of course, took another swerve with the appearance of the Black Death and its profound impact in every stratum of society in just about every place in the medieval world. After the first wave of the Great Pestilence subsided in 1350, the world looked considerably different than it had in 1348, and also considerably brighter for those who had managed to survive. And of course, we cannot escape in this story the appearance of serendipity, of the great good fortune accorded to history when a monk at Fulda perhaps said, "Oh wait, there's this other old book over here you might want to see." Or perhaps Bracciolini had the idea to stand on his tiptoes and look up to a shelf that might have contained something not visible from his normal standing position. Or maybe he glanced at the title, sighed, and thought, "Oh, here is that boring De Rerum Naturis again. I've seen this before." But then he decided to read a little further anyway, and suddenly realized that this was not the text he had initially assumed it was, but something altogether more exciting. We can't know exactly how these events played out, but no matter the particular sequence, it is obvious that luck, that serendipity, played some part here. And if we pause for a moment to consider the different kinds of turning point we've been talking about throughout this lecture series, we see here too how Bracciolini's rediscovery of the De Rerum Natura provides a fitting conclusion to our discussion. It was a turning point that we can trace to a specific moment in time, the moment when Bracciolini lifted the book down off the shelf. And in this regard, it is like the Norman Conquest, or the Magna Carta, or the day when Abelard was held down and forcibly castrated, or the moment when Pope Urban II called on Christians to take up arms and march east. It was, at the same time, a turning point that was rather stretched over time, like the development of a persecuting society, or shifts in agricultural technology, or the effects of the Little Optimum, or the fall of the Roman Empire itself. There was a considerable lapse of years between the moment when Bracciolini knew what he had, to when it was finally copied and started to circulate, to when it was printed and became more widely disseminated, to when its full significance was realized and seized upon by larger portions of society. And indeed, in some ways, Bracciolini's discovery is rather like the turning points of the Great Schism, or the Magna Carta, or the victory of King Arthur at Mountbatten. Much more discussed today, centuries later, and much more influential as an idea now than it was at the time it happened, our third category of turning point. It is only in hindsight that Magna Carta has achieved its near-mythic status, that the legend of King Arthur is so pervasive in the cultural consciousness, that the rift between the Latin and Eastern Orthodox churches seems so lamentable and insurmountable, that Stephen Greenblatt writes a book about an event that almost no one outside of academia had even heard of before the year 2011, and he wins a prize for it. But let me be clear. I think that The Swerve is a laudable achievement on all sorts of fronts, and Greenblatt is one of those rare, brilliant academic writers who is able to speak to a more general public without at all seeming to talk down to that public. He respects his audience, is excited about the story he wants to tell, and assumes, correctly, that many other people are going to be excited to hear that story as well. Along the way, he imparts fascinating information about medieval religion, social structures, literary traditions, and more. The book is as commendable for its ability to paint a vivid picture of a bygone age as it is for tracing in such detail how De Rerum Natura was rediscovered. But if this event fits neatly, like the turning point of the fall of Rome, into our three main categories, it also fits into our fourth category, in that in some respects, it is not a turning point at all. One could argue that nothing much changed because of Bracciolini's discovery. The medieval world was already on its way to being modern. It had swerved so many times before this, when Rome fell, when Charlemagne set up his palace school at Aachen, when Otto's forces rode over the Magyars at Lechfeld, when Eleanor of Aquitaine divorced the King of France, when Fibonacci introduced Arabic numerals to Europe, when Salerno formed the first university, and when Gutenberg set up his printing press. All of these earlier course corrections meant that society was already thinking in such a way that De Rerum Natura had an audience willing to hear the voice of a poet dead almost 1,500 years. In a way, this story helps me make the point I've been emphasizing all along much better than I could myself. From the moment Rome fell, the medieval world was heading toward the early modern, toward Shakespeare and the discovery of the Americas and the Protestant Reformation and the brilliance of Leonardo da Vinci and so much more. Every turning point in the medieval world that we've discussed in the last 24 lectures shifted the flow of the river of history, bringing us ever closer to the modern world, to today, and to the end of this course. Thank you for joining me on this journey.
We hope you have enjoyed these lectures from the Great Courses. Our courses are now available to order online. Visit our website at thegreatcourses.com or call our customer care representatives at 1-800-832-2412. That's 1-800-832-2412. Thank you very much.